Welcome to the Productivity Show podcast, where we believe that you can get everything done without having to sacrifice your health, family, and things that matter to you. Hi, this is Tam Pham. I'm the founder and CEO of Asian Efficiency, where we help people become more productive at work and in life. And today I'm joined by my co-host, Brooks Duncan. How are you today, Brooks?
I'm great. Though in my corporate career, if you had told me that someday I'd be doing a podcast about meetings, I would have found that very, very surprising. So I'm excited to dive into this topic because I know I have been in lots and lots and lots of meetings in my career, and I'm sure you have as well.
Yeah, I think when most people hear the word meeting, they go, ugh, like not another one, right? But in this episode, we're going to be talking about how you can make them a little bit more fun and more efficient as well. Because I know a lot of you dread the idea of just going to meetings, and we totally get that. But they are useful if you make them useful, and they are actionable if you make them actionable. So we're going to show you some ways to make them a little bit more fun and actionable as well, so that people actually want to attend the meetings. So if you're listening to this and you're someone who leads meetings, I think you're going to be finding a few tips here and there that are going to be really helpful for you to make the meetings a little bit more engaging and fun. But also, if you're someone who's listening and you feel like, man, I have so many meetings that I don't want to attend all of them, but I kind of have to be there. Like, what are some things that you can do to make them a little bit more better, more efficient as a participant as well? And I know some of you who are listening don't have a lot of meetings, but you want to make your meetings just a little bit more efficient as you are listening to this. We'll have some tips and strategies for you here as well. You can find links to everything that we talked about in the show notes by going to theproductivityshow.com/378. As always, we like to kick things off with our top three favorite resources as of lately. And I'll have three of them here that I'm going to share with you. So the first one is a book called Fun Retrospectives. This is also a website called Fun Retrospectives by the same author. And it's basically a list of ideas to make your retrospectives or retros more fun and engaging. Now, if you're not familiar with what a retrospective is, it's kind of like a review in a way. You can do this for your personal life or in a team setting. And we have a podcast episode about this as well that we can link to in the show notes. But I highly recommend that you check this out because you can use this in your meetings as well. The second tip that I have here, or resource, is a cereal brand that I really started enjoying recently, and it's called Magic Spoon. So if you're like me, you grew up eating cereals, and nowadays when you're a little bit more health conscious, you go, oh my gosh, this is not good for me at all. There's so much sugar and stuff like that, right? Well, Magic Spoon basically figured out how to make delicious cereals with no sugar, make them low carb and high protein. So it's kind of like the best of everything. So I personally like the frosted flavor the most, and they have a fruity flavor as well that I really like. So I highly recommend you check out this brand. And then the third one is a book called Die with Zero. And this is a book written by Bill Perkins. And his main message of the book is that the business of life is the acquisition of memories and experiences. And ideally, what you want to do is by the time you pass away, you have no money left. And that's a sign that you, in a way, spend your money correctly and make the most out of your life, both for yourself, but also for your kids as well. So it's not about spending money so that there's nothing left for your kids. There's actually other ways you can spend money throughout the rest of your life and make your kids' life better and happier as well. But you all have to dive into the book because we actually talked about this on the meeting today. And I think everyone really enjoyed the concepts, but you would really have to dive into the book to check it out. So again, Die with Zero by Bill Perkins. And again, we'll have links to all of that in the show notes. Next week's episode is one of our favorite topics that we do every single year, and it's called the Productivity Gift Guide. I know the holiday season is just around the corner, so if you have to buy some gifts for people who are in your life that mean a lot to you and you want to make them more productive, or they love productivity stuff, I think you're going to really enjoy next week's episode. So be sure to check back next week.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that, Tan. Yeah, really looking forward to doing that productivity gift guide episode. My family, we're starting to do our shared Apple Notes list of different gift ideas. So I'm going to be using that episode to throw some onto mine. But we are talking about this week, we're talking about meetings. And on the Productivity Show, we always talk about the three main levers of productivity. You got your time, you've got your energy, and you've got your attention. We call it the T framework. You can learn more about that at theproductivityshow.com/T. And meetings are like a team And meetings are like a T framework trifecta. They have a big impact on all three areas. Clearly they can take a lot of time, which leaves less time for other things. Meetings can drain a lot of energy, especially online meetings, which we've talked about on the show before. It's really hard to get into deep work after a long meeting because you're just so drained. And then, of course, meetings can mess up your attention. They can disrupt your flow, or even worse, you always see people trying to work while in some sort of online meeting. Maybe you've got your email up and then you're not really giving focus and attention to either thing. So meetings really can attack all three areas of the T framework. So we're going to be trying to fix meetings once and for all in this episode. And there are a lot of common advice out there about meetings. And this advice is common for a reason, because it's really actually good advice. Start and end meetings on time, have an agenda, assign someone to take notes, or in the live stream to this episode that we record along with our Dojo and TPS Plus members, Phil says that he always takes notes because he doesn't necessarily trust the assigned note taker, which is great as well. Take your own notes. End by reviewing action items. These are all really great tips, and you should definitely do all of them, frankly. So what we're going to do is we're going to try and go a bit beyond them and give 3 tips for having meetings that people will actually want to attend. And this applies to local meetings, online meetings, either way. And, the tip does not involve bringing snacks. That's always welcome for in-person meetings, but we're not going to be covering that one. That's another really good advice. But we are going to be going through those 3 tips that meetings we're going to be going through 3 tips for meetings people will actually want to attend. And tip number 1 is to make your meeting action biased. And we've all been there, right? We've all been sitting in meetings thinking, why am I here? Like, what is the purpose of this meeting? Or even worse, you walk out of a meeting and you're thinking, well, that was pointless. It could have been an email. I'm sure we've all been in meetings that really should have been an email or a one-on-one phone call or something like that. So we said earlier that meetings should end by reviewing action items, and it should really be clear that by the end of the meeting, there's that saying, who will do what by when. So all meetings should end with everybody knowing who will do what by when. And most meetings don't. So even if you can apply that, that's good. But we recommend even going beyond that. And ideally, you want to make your entire meeting action bias, which means the whole purpose of gathering people together and the purpose of the topics that are going to be discussed in the meeting should be for some sort of action to be taken. And if you don't have that, the meeting probably shouldn't happen. There should probably be a better format, like we said earlier, like an email or a recorded video or something like that. Because we want to have meetings that people actually want to attend, or at least don't actively hate attending. And people don't mind attending a meeting as much if they feel that they have been actively contributed to moving things forward, or if the meeting has helped them in some way. And at a high level, there's 3 types of meetings, because it doesn't seem really obvious that some types of meetings are actionable, right? There's like meetings where you're getting together people to discuss you're getting people together to discuss a situation and figure out what to do. That's one type. Number 2 is maybe you're informing a group about some information. And number 3 is maybe you're just sharing status updates. And while it might sound surprising, it is possible to make all of those action bias. So Tan, maybe you could take us through how of these 3 types: situational meetings, informational meetings, and status updates. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how we can actually make those actionable in some way.
Sure. So the first one, situation discussion meetings. I think what's oftentimes done in big companies is they'll invite people because they think it might be highly relevant to them, right? And so there's a lot of people on a particular meeting, when oftentimes what you can do is make the meeting smaller when you only have people who are directly involved. So you kind of want to avoid the people who are like, oh yeah, this would be nice for that person to know, right? Or for them to be informed, or quote unquote, to save time so you don't have to send that follow-up email. But it's much more efficient if you only have people directly involved with the project or goal on that particular meeting. And then that way you can end it with the three W's, right? So who will do what by when. And I want to make sure that everyone ends their meeting with the three W's. That's something I always try to remind myself too, is let's make sure we end our meetings with the three W's. Who will do what by when? So there is a person assigned that knows what needs to be done, and then there's a deadline associated with that, right? If we don't set a deadline with it, it's easy then to bump things down or for that person not to know how to prioritize things. And then they typically move stuff downwards because, you have competing goals, whether it's like your personal goals, company goals, team goals, like there might be a lot of competing priorities. So we always want to make sure that we only have people on those particular meetings that are directly involved, and everyone that would be kind of, nice to know, you would just send them an email after the meeting is done. So that way we save a lot more time, right? You also have informational meetings, which is basically like, hey, we just need to broadcast pieces of information that everyone needs to know, right? And so that in that situation, it's better to just send an email or something like that, or have like a presentation or some form of a format that allows people to easily consume something without having to spend a lot of time, right? And so for me, like, sending an email is an easy way to do that. Or if you have a weekly meeting with your whole team, you can kind of quickly run through that sort of stuff. And it's just highly efficient. You don't have to know exactly what you have to do other than just consuming information. If you set that precedence at the beginning of the meeting as well, everyone just knows like, okay, this is just an information meeting. Let's just take it in, go through it, and then off we go, right? And then other meetings, like the third one here is a status update. And whenever you have something like that, oftentimes it doesn't have to be a meeting at all. And so anytime you feel like, oh, I just want to update people on something really small, instead of getting people together in a room, what if you just send them an email or a Slack message or like some sort of team update on whatever online tool you use that everyone uses, and everyone can kind of check in, whenever they need to. And especially with email, I would be careful as well, because I know, sometimes you get emails that go, hey, there's donuts, in the kitchen, and then it says like, do not reply or don't need to respond to this email. But that again, is just another email for people to process, right? So anytime you can kind of minimize that as well is something I would always recommend.
Yeah. And even if you are quote unquote just a meeting attendee, like you might be sitting there thinking, well, that's great advice for people who create meetings, but usually I'm not the one driving the meeting. Even if you're an attendee, you can still try and influence the meeting to be more action biased by asking more action-based questions, like try to introduce the three W's, like Tan said. If the meeting holder aren't doing that, you can try to introduce those. You can try to offer action items. So depending on your situation, of course, there's ways you can influence this and make them more action-based when you are an attendee. That's one thing I have to say I've appreciated since joining Agent Efficiency is generally our meetings are very action-oriented. And this is where I kind of learned a lot of this. When we have our daily huddle, which you could make the argument are kind of status updates, but we really dedicate them to clearing roadblocks and making sure everybody has what they need. So that's number one. When we have our weekly meeting, it's not just a status update. We're reviewing feedback and looking for trends and trying to resolve situations. And so we try to take an action-based approach to all the meetings that we have in the company. All right. Oh, go ahead, Dan.
Nope, I'm good.
All right. So tip number 2, before we get into that, I'd like to give a shout out. I mentioned earlier that our dojo and TPS Plus members are in the live stream along with us. And so that is a real benefit of TPS Plus, which is our enhanced version of the productivity show. So you get episodes a week early, you get them ad-free, you attend the live stream, you can see the show notes that Tan and I use to record these episodes, the actual show notes that we use with all our little notes and things that maybe even didn't make it into the episode a lot of times. And if you join the annual plan, which I'm going to say actually most members do, you get a 1 tweak a week t-shirt, which is really, really popular. So thank you so much for our TPS Plus supporters. We really, really appreciate you. So let's roll into tip number 2. So tip number 1 was to make your meetings action biased. Tip number 2 is to consolidate your meetings as much as possible. Because no matter how productive a meeting is, even if you walk out of that meeting saying, that was great, you still can't avoid the fact that meetings are disruptive to whatever else is going on. Going back to what we were talking about earlier with the T framework, with attention, even for a short meeting, it just breaks your focus to stop what you're doing, mentally prepare for the meeting, have the meeting, then you're decompressing from the meeting and trying to switch back to what you're doing. So all this context switching is just like an attention nightmare when we look at the T framework. So the best solution, of course, is to have fewer meetings. So question number 1 you want to ask yourself, like we touched on earlier, is does this really even need to have to be a meeting? And of course, is this action bias, going back to tip number 1? So if you can, try to find another medium and save everyone that time and energy and attention. But of course, that's not always possible. In many cases, it actually does make a lot of sense to have a meeting. So if you feel that the meeting should still happen, our tip for you is to try and consolidate your meetings. And what we mean by this is, of course, in one way, combine meetings if you can. But if the meetings are like really segmented and make sense to have separate meetings, try to have them on as much of the same day as possible. And this is going to sound crazy, so stay with me here. But instead of, say, having a weekly team meeting on Tuesday, maybe your accounting meeting on Wednesday, your customer service meeting on Thursday, try to have them all, for example, like Tuesday morning back to back with a little bit of a break, of course. This is really the only time that we do recommend having back-to-back meetings, which we talked about a few weeks ago in TPS 354. And this concept of having a meeting day or consolidated meetings, it does sound crazy, maybe it does sound exhausting, and honestly, it can be, but it can be really, really powerful. And I believe we got the idea from a book called Scaling Up, which we'll link to in the show notes. And the benefits of this is that everybody gets in that meeting mindset and flow. You're in like meeting mode during that time, and everybody's already there. The context switching is reduced because for the rest of the week, your week is freed up for deep work, focus, talking to customers, whatever it is that's important in your role. Because you have those meetings consolidated, it opens up just so much more time and focus and attention throughout the rest of the week. And also, a lot of issues can just be knocked off if key decision makers are there to get people unstuck, like meeting after meeting after meeting. It can be a really productive use for those like key employees, senior employees, and stuff like that. So Tan, I have a question for you because this is something that you suggested for AE years ago. Full disclosure, the rest of the team did think it was kind of a wacky idea, but we thought, well, I know Tan likes doing productivity experiments, so let's roll with it. I mean, obviously it works because we're still doing meeting day on Wednesday mornings years later. So my question for you is, what is it that made you suggest it? I know you read a lot of productivity information, so what was it about this particular thing that caught your attention? How do you think it's gone, and what do you think the benefit has been for you, both as CEO and for the rest of the company?
So I did stumble upon this idea initially from the Scaling Up book that you mentioned, and I thought, oh, that's an interesting idea. Maybe we will do it at some point. And I think what happened a few times was we would have meetings on, let's say, Monday, and then Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and some even on Fridays. And sometimes what would happen is one of the people that needed to be on that meeting would then not be able to be on the meeting because maybe they took a early weekend or something, a 3-day weekend, or maybe on a Monday there's like usually a holiday, so it's like an extended weekend. And I noticed that sometimes when that would happen, we would roll the meeting over to make sure that that person was there, especially if you're in a small company and we need to have everyone involved, whether it's like brainstorming ideas or reviewing stuff together or working on stuff together. Sometimes it's just not as productive to send an email follow-up and say, hey, this is what we did, because sometimes we do need crucial feedback and live interaction with that person. And so I kind of started to realize, okay, first of all, if I want to have everyone on the meeting, it's probably best not to have meetings on Fridays. and also not on Mondays, because those are most often days when people take off. And so then I said, okay, what if we have meetings on Wednesday? Because then everyone is typically at work, right? Most people don't take a Wednesday off. There's usually not a holiday or something on a Wednesday. So let's do it on Wednesday. And oh yeah, by the way, I heard about this tip doing all your meetings in one day. Let's just do that at the same time while we're doing it. And so it was kind of like an idea by accident to just give it a try and see what would happen. And yes, logically, you might say, okay, it's beneficial to move it from Tuesday to Wednesday and Thursday to Wednesday as well, so that you can work on the other days. But you don't really know how convenient and nice that is until you actually do it. And being able to just show up, at work on Monday and Tuesday, and there's like absolutely no meetings, is actually really nice, because then you can really block out long blocks of time for you to focus and do stuff. And then, yes, there's a lot of meetings on Wednesdays, but because they're all on the same day, you also kind of know that when you show up on Wednesday, that you don't really have to do a lot of quote unquote work. You just have to do a lot of decision making and kind of like administrative work. And so you kind of shift gears in a way where you know that, okay, I'm going to show up on Wednesday not doing stuff. So I need to make sure that I can do stuff on the other days, like Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday and Friday. And that kind of like theming or focus allows you to really make a lot of progress on certain projects, because like I have a whole day carved out for this. Like I can work on this the whole day, knowing that there's nothing that is really going to interrupt you or is scheduled to interrupt you in that sense. So that's really nice, especially when you're working from home and you have a lot of flexibility, which we have in our company. I find that very convenient and nice to have. It's not even a perk; it's just an efficiency thing for everyone.
Yeah, if you're in a small, nimble team like we are, of course, it's pretty easy in general to like move meetings around and do something like that. So that works really well. If you're in like a larger organization or a bigger, maybe not so flexible, obviously it might not be as easy for you, especially right off the bat, to move everything to one day. However, try, if you can, at least do some experiments doing it in stages. Like if you need to call a meeting, see if you can tie it to other meetings. See if you can, maybe amongst your team at least, consolidate things even a little bit. You might not be able to get everything on one day, but the more you can like consolidate and cluster things with the bias towards leaving open space at other times, you'll be surprised. It's very, very helpful. The more you can pull it off, the better. So that is tip number 2, to consolidate your meetings. Now, tip number 3 is to write down questions and have a mechanism for answering them. And the reason we give this tip is not maybe for the reason that you would think, because what ends up happening is a lot of times what gets discussed in a meeting and what people actually think at the end of the meeting are often very different. And I'm sure many of us have been in this situation of like the meeting after the meeting, right? Everybody gets in a meeting, topic is discussed, things are banged around, maybe there's even some action items. And then maybe like in the lunchroom after or on Slack or Teams, like a few people talk about what, they really thought or what the meeting was really, really about. And so that is a very difficult situation. And the reason this comes up often is because a few people often dominate the conversations. We've all been in meetings like that. Introverts might not feel comfortable speaking up, especially in in-person meetings. A lot of times what's called the hippo effect takes place, which is the highest paid person's opinion often gets overweighted. Like their opinion might not be, in some cases, the most informed or best. Maybe the people closer to the action might have more helpful feedback, but the hippo's opinion often tends to be overweighted. And even a cohesive team where everybody gets along, donuts in the lunchroom, like Tan said, everybody is friendly, that even a team like that can often have surprising lack of trust when it comes to like really having productive conflict and really making everybody's voices heard. So, there's kind of like long-term ideal fixes and there's short-term fixes. In a perfect world, in a ideal like longer-term fix, you would address what is covered in the book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, which we talked about in that back-to-back meetings episode, but basically the 5 dysfunctions of a team are absence of trust, so being unwilling to be vulnerable within the group. There's fear of conflict, seeking that artificial harmony that so often happens, especially in corporate meetings. There's a lack of commitment. Everybody like pretends to buy in, but then the meeting after the meeting happens where people talk about what they really think. There's avoidance of accountability, and there's inattention to results. So all these things together can often really mask problems that nobody even might even realize that they have. It's just that the team isn't as effective as it could be. So a short-term fix to at least some of these, not all of them, but some of them, is if you're an attendee, a lot of times as you're going through, questions or objections might pop into your head, but we don't have an opportunity or maybe confidence to voice them at that time, like to interject into a stream of discussion and make our views known. And then perhaps at the end, we maybe forgot about those things we thought in the moment, or maybe we leave them unsaid because we just didn't have the confidence to pop in. So a recommendation we would have is, as thoughts come up in a meeting, write them down at the time. Then if the opportunity does come up during or even after the meeting, you have them there in front of you, and you can try to loop back and have them presented in some way if that's possible. But this act of writing it down makes them a lot more real, and makes it a lot more likely that you're going to be able to contribute your feedback that you might not have been able to do in the meeting, that you might not have been able to do in the moment. So that's as an attendee. Now, on the flip side of that, as a meeting host, what we recommend that you do is encourage people to do that. Encourage people to write down their questions or feedback as it's going through. Because again, this makes it more real. It makes it more likely that you'll be able to get that feedback. And then if it's at all appropriate, try to provide opportunities during the meeting, not just at the end, to keep people engaged and discuss questions and feedback. So instead of just like steaming through all your topics and then in the last 5 minutes of the meeting, ask if there's any questions, see if you can like engage people, bring them in as it's going through the meeting. And then if it works out, and this is especially true in person, but it could work online as well, try to have time and a mechanism to collect those written questions. If you're on like Zoom or a web platform, maybe you can use the Q&A feature or direct messaging or something like that. Or if it's in an in-person meeting, you could even like collect the question notes for people who don't feel comfortable speaking up. And then you can go through and discuss those questions that you've collected at the end. So it makes it so that you're bringing feedback out of people that you might not otherwise have had. And really, it's going to make for a much better and more useful meeting for everybody, not just the more extroverted and influential people who usually dominates these meetings. Because if people feel like, looping back to what we talked about earlier, people don't mind meetings if they feel that it's valuable. So if people feel like their contributions are listened to, the meeting will be seen as having a much higher value. Otherwise, what's the point of even attending a meeting if your input is not valued? What do you think, Tan, as somebody who runs a lot of meetings? Do you do any of this, or have you tried any of this to try and like make the meeting more useful for everybody?
I think what's very true is that if you look at, let's say, the last 5 meetings that you had, and you look at who spoke up and who didn't, you'll probably notice that it's oftentimes the same people that tend to speak up, right? That doesn't mean that the people who didn't speak up don't have an opinion or thoughts or feedback. It's just oftentimes, as the meeting host, if you don't do a good job of like letting them to speak up, then oftentimes it's either too late and they, come to you after the meeting, or they don't, and then the meeting just ends and you don't get the best feedback or thought or feedback loop from everyone that was there. And so I think as the meeting host, it's always very important to allow everyone to speak up, and you want to make it easy in a way that it allows them to speak up and be comfortable in front of other people. And kind of like you mentioned, the 5 dysfunctions of a team, we want to make sure that as the meeting host, we set the tone at the beginning of the meeting so that everyone can speak up. So an easy thing to do when you start a meeting is have a really simple icebreaker, which is something that I every now and then will do in our meetings. depending one, how I feel like speaking up that day, but also two, if I notice on other meetings that people don't talk as much or aren't as talkative as they used to be, then I'll oftentimes bust it out. So an icebreaker could be something like, what's your favorite cereal growing up? Or, who was your hero when you were like, a teenager? And basically you're asking a question that everyone will quickly share. So it allows everyone to speak up. And when everyone has spoken up at the beginning, they feel more comfortable now speaking up the rest of the meeting. So the way you start the meeting and set the tone allows everyone to kind of like follow that lead, right? But I'm sure you've been in this situation too. Like if you're the meeting host and you do most of the talking in the beginning, it becomes a lot more challenging for other people to speak up later on because they feel like you've always been dominating the meetings, right? So having regular check-ins, having opportunity and space, even calling people out sometimes in a good way, saying, hey, Brooks, I haven't heard from you at this meeting yet, and I really value your opinion. What are your thoughts so far on what we just talked about, right? And you'll be surprised what kind of feedback and thoughts you get that way when you allow people to speak up, whether it's by directly calling them or just checking in with people on a regular basis. So I want to make sure as the host that I'm always doing that because I have them on the meeting for a reason. If I didn't value their opinion or I didn't hear from them, why are they in the meeting in the first place, right? Especially when we're talking about making things action biased, let's make sure that everyone is contributing in their own way.
Yeah, this whole thing is a very big work in progress for me, mainly as an attendee. I am generally a very introverted person. I'm famously so. People somehow know me online as a massive introvert, and it's all very true, except I'm not introverted in meetings, as Tan will attest. And so I've really tried to do work holding space for the colleagues who don't speak up as much. And one pro tip, this is both as a attendee and as a meeting holder with online meetings, is if you see somebody unmute themselves and then mute themselves again, that's usually a sign that that person kind of like brought up the courage to say something, but then maybe someone else like talked over them or felt that the opportunity was no longer there. So if you see that happen, that can be a good opportunity to try and bring someone in, because chances are they did have some valuable input to say. They just decided to like pull the ripcord and bail at the last second. So if you see that happen, that can be a good way to bring people in. All right, so Tan, we've done our 3 tips for having meetings that people actually want to attend. So number 1 was make your meetings action biased. Number 2 was consolidate your meetings. And number 3 was to write down questions and have a mechanism for sharing and answering them. If somebody was going to take like one action item away from this and put into action, what would you recommend they start with?
Yeah, as always, we want to make things simple and actionable. So what I would recommend you do next is review all the meetings that you either hold and attend. So just go over your calendar and just look at the last few meetings you've either attended or held. And then think about what can you do to make them more action biased, not just something that just takes up everyone's time. How can you make those meetings more action biased, the ones that you attend and the ones that you hold on a regular basis? And maybe it's just one thing that you can do better, right? Whether it's checking in with people, whether it's ending a meeting with the 3 W's, whether it is something else that we've talked about today, just implement one thing that we've talked about today. And I'm pretty sure most of your meetings are going to be way more agent efficient and effective as well. Thanks for joining us. If you want to find links that we talked, if you want to find links to everything that we talked about today, go to our show notes. You can find them at theproductivityshow.com/378. And next week's episode is about the productivity gift guides. So be sure to check back next week. And thanks again for joining us. And we'll see you next Productive Monday.